But we still don't really know who had been singing the songs to Lars. Then suddenly she speaks again.
Sometimes the waters tell us stories too, and she's gesturing into the well, and there you are drawn into the silver light and see a reflection of another woman, young, with silver gold hair and emerald green eyes. You look more closely and feel yourself sucked into the water, and then suddenly the sensation of flying, and you are soaring up and over a river, a long twisting river that snakes through the land and eventually opens out into an estuary. This is the Dyfi estuary, and we are going back in time to hear another story. As you descend, you see her, silver gold hair first, shining in the sunlight, sitting by her well between forest and sea on the edges of the kingdom of Cantre'r Gwaelod. She, the king's daughter, Mererid. Mererid was a water maiden. She'd had an affinity with water since birth, and at a very young age, her father, Gwyddno Garanhir, gave her the very important task of serving people a cup of sweet well water. This water was the purest in all the surrounding lands and highly prized by visitors. She loved the responsibility of this sacred duty. When she was just 10, she started helping the person that was responsible for the irrigation system that flowed right through the kingdom's many cities and allowed people to cultivate crops so close to the salty shore. And when she was just 13, that very magical age, Mererid was given the greatest responsibility of all, that of shutting the great wooden sluice gates that protected the kingdom during spring tides and storms. Mererid loved her job. She thought it was the best. And when she had nothing else to do, she whiled away the hours, singing to the well, singing to the salt waves. It could be said that this was the most important aspect of her job, for it kept a good relationship between her and her people and the waters. Ysbryd yr afon, ysbryd y dŵr, water unclear, water unpure, ysbryd y ffynnon, ysbryd y môr, water unclear forevermore. Most people came visiting the kingdom when there was a party, and her father loved to throw a good party. And his people, well, most of them loved him for it. Mererid loved him, but not so much the parties. They were too raucous for her, and far too much booze was knocked back on those nights for her liking, and she could not stand the leeriness and the hairiness of many of the men. Well, to be honest, hairiness had nothing to do with it. She just wasn't that into men. Mererid turned, for she heard a horse's hooves emerging from the trees behind her, and out from between two great oaks came a horse, a beautiful white steed. Shame about the rider. It was him, Sain, her least favourite man of all. He came trotting up, his clumsiness, his heftiness visible even on such a graceful horse. What was he doing here? Of course, there must be a party. He only ever came when there was a party. She didn't know what her father saw in him, but then he didn't have to put up with the flirtatious quips, the none too accidental brushes of hands on her hips. Dewch i'r party, Mererid? Na saethon nhw, dydw I ddim yn dod i'r party. Dŵr? She offered him a cup of water. He drank it, slammed it down on the edge of the well. She winced and scowled at him. He stood far too close to her, didn't move away. So she stepped back, started singing to the well once more. Ignored, Sain eventually walked off, down the bank, over the great Alder Bridge, through the great castle gates. She hoped he would not come back. Why was there a party tonight of all nights? Her father should have consulted her. She was the water expert after all. The sky had been pink that morning, just as the day was dawning and when her friend Owl was still up. And everyone knew, well, surely everyone knew that pink sky was a warning. She was sure of it. There would be a storm that night. She could feel the water growing in the air already. Well, she would have to stay vigilant. Absolutely no parties for her tonight. She didn't want to go anyway. She would stay here. She'd have to shut those sluice gates and ring that great bronze bell that sat at the very top of the tallest tower in her father's castle. She'd have to go just at the right moment. The next hours passed with greeting partygoers, welcoming them. She enjoyed this part of her job. Most of the people were very pleasant, some of them even quite interesting, and she whiled away the time in between arrivals with singing to the waters. As the day went on though, she started to get a little anxious, for there were many guests. People just kept coming. People dressed to the nines in their long flowing robes. She was worried that, well, other people didn't seem to be aware of the impending storm and she couldn't leave her duties at the well. She would have to go and shut those gates and ring that bell at some point. As the sun neared setting in the sky, its light refracted through the gathering clouds, Mererid noticed how much choppier the waves had got, how much louder and more active the wind was now. She would have to go soon. And it was at that very moment, when the last ray of sun disappeared, blood-red line through the cloud, that she saw the castle doors open. It was him again. Mererid rolled her eyes. Oh. He staggered over the bridge, a bottle in his hand. Gwyn, Mererid! Na saethon nhw, dydw I ddim yn yfed gwyn. Dŵr? She offered him another cup of water. As much as she didn't want to serve him, she wanted to sober him up, for by experience he was far worse when drunk. He downed it in one this time and then belched in her face. Ach a fi! She turned away, stepped behind the well, went back to singing and ignoring him. But he didn't go away. Pam dwyt ti ddim yn y party, Mererid? Oherwydd. She shrugged her shoulders. He stood there for a few more moments and then walked down the bank, over the bridge. Mererid noticed he slipped slightly, that there were small pools of water gathering from the sea's waves on the bridge already. When halfway across the bridge, he turned, gave her one of his leering smiles. She didn't like that at all. But then he was out of sight, the doors slammed behind him, gone. If anyone was going to bother her, Mererid thought, why couldn't it be the young poet Taliesin? He would not try and pressure her into anything, and he appreciated the quiet music of the waters as much as she did. It was dusk. Mererid saw her friend the eagle dive into the trees behind her. Owl emerged for the night shift, and she heard the faint tunings up of the castle's musicians on their instruments, their magical instruments made from the breath of many birds, from the secrets told to trees. Mererid felt a slight pang to be there, but she knew that this was the best bit, that the tunes later on would be far too rowdy for her. She preferred the music of the waters. La 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 ya ya lo, la la ya ya yo, la la ya ya yo lo, la la ya ya yo, la la ya yo, la no. The next hours passed with the rising of the moon, full and yellow in sun's opposite motion through the forest. Mererid spent her time singing to the waters, welcoming more guests. It started to rain. The wind had picked up even more. The waves were becoming violent, bashing the sides of the castle and other buildings. She was worried, just a little worried, and she sung a song of prayer to the waters that they would let her know when the right moment to go and shut those gates was, to go and ring that great bronze bell. Well, she caught Owl's eye, shared a look. Mererid tried not to let her anxiety get the better of her, kept singing, her voice weaving perfectly with the fluid sound layers. But that fear she could not shift. What was it? The moon rose, eventually casting its path of light on the ocean, where it shattered into splinters of silver across the surface of the waves. She could not shake that feeling. This time she knew he was coming, before she heard him, before she saw him. Those doors flung open, and he was stomping over the bridge, barely standing upright now. Going at such a pace, she thought he wouldn't stop until he reached her. And he didn't stop until he reached her, and suddenly he was grabbing her hip. She tried to throw his hand off, but couldn't, and so she plunged the goblet into the well, shoved it in his face, and then he threw the goblet down onto the stone wall. She darted to catch it, and then he threw her into the well as well. She bashed her head badly, sat dazed on the stone wall. Suddenly Mererid felt a cold bottle forced into her mouth and fizzing, fermenting honey flowing down her throat. Mererid. This drink could have been sacred and delicious, but it was not. Her mind clouded like the darkening sky, and as she slid down the side of the well's wall, just one thought went round and round in her head. The bell, the bell, the bell. When Sain left her there, he stumbled down that bank and slipped on his very first step onto the bridge, knocking himself unconscious. That great bell would not be rung by Mererid now. It was rung, though, by a musician who stepped outside to look at the moon and got more than they wished for. But it was too late to shut the sluice gates now. There was too much water to control. The rest of the partygoers remained blissfully unaware until the last. They were having a brilliant time. but Ail watched overhead as the sea began to claim the buildings for its own. There would not be another party in Cantre'r Gwaelod, not on land anyway. The moon was high and cold in the sky now, a shrewd eye, observing all, and it saw the top of the very tallest building, that great bell tower, disappear under the boiling sea. When Mererid awoke, she felt something soft brushing her forehead. It was Owl's wing. She opened her eyes. Well, she tried to open her eyes, and she tried again and again, but they did not seem to be opening. It was dark. There was no moon anymore. There was no anything, just sea. It was halfway up the bank now, and her back was wet. The well water had begun to overflow, and it was cascading in rivulets right down to the edge of the sea. Ail seemed to be encouraging her to stand up, and she did, and found herself walking slowly, pulling up her skirts, tucking them into her waistband as though she was going to the sluice gates, walking right to the point where the two waters met in their seething cauldron of inevitability. She stood there, watching, listening some more. And Mererid thought she heard the bell. The bell and some fragments of the faintest harp music. Owl flew in circles over her, watching and listening as well. And at dawn she was joined by her companion, Eagle. She filled him in on everything, and they flew in figures of 8 together to see how things would unfold. And it's here that we must leave Mererid. We're going to hitch a ride back with Owl and with Eagle to the cave. Maybe they will tell us what happened next. Other birds join us, a scattering of seagulls, a murmuration of starlings, and many, many more. And as we soar upwards, we see the changing landscape of Wales, hear its changing soundscape. And you ask Owl, ask Eagle, did many survive? Owl replied, well, a few did escape over land, if that's what you mean. The young Taliesin went up north to share his work in another court. Some sadly drowned, of course, but others, well, others found ways of transforming into Morforwen, Selkie, people of the sea. And Mererid, well, she was a special one, that pearl. She had such an affinity with the rolling waves, with that sweet well water. For her, the transition was easy. And not only that, she had such good relation with the birds, with us people of the air, and with the wind, and with the trees, the people of the earth, with the soil, that she became a shapeshifter, metamorphosing between the realms. And some even say that it was her children that became the first inhabitants of the land of Rhys Dyfn, a miraculous utopia that sprung up in exactly the same location where Cantre'r Gwaelod once had been, a place where every being respected one another and where there was harmony.
As we begin to descend over the land towards the cave, you see a small dot, half crawling, half leaping rather awkwardly, as though trying in vain to catch up, desperately looking upwards with big coppery eyes. Eagle and owl drop you in through a hole in the top of the cave, and you land on a soft cushion of moss.
Lars is there waiting for you. And after not too long a while, you are both joined by a toad, an old toad. You see the silhouettes of the two great birds reflected on the surface of Lars's well. Eagle and owl, airborne guardians of day and night, fly sometimes alone and sometimes together, bringing down the harmonies of the skies for us to enjoy here on earth. These two ancient birds have seen and heard it all. Not as much as old toad though, the old toad of Borthbog, I'll have you know, who brought them together in this unlikely union. But that is another story. Right now, old toad has come to inspect the progress of the sound map. He has a particular relationship with ancient stones and considers himself a receptacle for all the wisdom that they hold, all those eons of witnessing changes of the land and the waters. He gets by eating the dust people create when they etch shapes and words into the walls. And there have been many people, not just Lars, you know. Lars, water-bearer, fully awoken to her task of song collecting, is gradually adding her part to this great sound map of Wales and of the world here in this cave. Will you help her by listening to the land, water and air around you, by expressing with your own unique creativity, by sharing your songs, stories, sounds and experiences with others, human and more than human? It will never be finished. The sound map will continue to evolve with us as old species die out, as new ones are born, as stories shift with the times, as the sea levels continue to rise. It will certainly never be finished until all lost voices are remembered, until silent and silenced ones are heard. Never underestimate the power of your voice or of your creativity.
Ni fydd byth yn gorffen, bydd y map Sain yn dal I esblygu gyda ni, wrth I hen rywogaethau farw allan, wrth I rhai newydd gael ei geni, wrth I straeon symud gyda'r oes, wrth I lefelau'r môr barhau I godi. Yn sicr, ni fydd byth yn cael ei orffen, nes bod yr holl leisiau coll yn cael ei cofio, nes clywed rhai distaw a thawer. Peidiwch byth a diystori pŵer eich llais nach creadigrwydd.
Together now, we can find ways to collectively remember, and it is in our listening, in our remembering, in our sharing that we bring each other to life, that we can restore the greater balance and bring light from the darkness and harmony to the land, waters and skies. Maybe we can find that utopia just by happening on the right angle as we watch the waves, or even in a puddle's reflection on a city pavement. Perhaps by listening carefully enough to hear the harmony of the land, carefully enough to hear the song of the stars, or a blackbird trilling above the motorway, by tuning into the wisdom of the ancient stones and the waters that ever flow outside us and in and all around, and by valuing our own unique parts in this symphony. And will you help to create this sound map?